I'm Jamie Dopp from White River Valley Electric Cooperative in Branson, Missouri. Welcome to Along Those Lines.
This episode's sponsor is Power & Tel, your trusted source for fiber, broadband, and infrastructure deployment solutions. With decades of experience, they help electric cooperatives power the future. Learn more at ptsupply.com.
Hi, everyone. This is a podcast about electric cooperatives, the work they do, and the challenges they face. I'm Molly Christian, guest hosting for Scott Hoffman. The 2024 elections were pivotal for policies affecting electric co-ops. President Donald Trump's victory and Republicans' majorities in Congress could bring major changes to environmental rules, permitting requirements, funding programs, and tax incentives that touch on co-ops' daily operations. Today, we'll talk with Louis Finkel, NRECA's Senior Vice President of Government Relations, about what those changes could be and what they mean for co-ops. Welcome to the podcast, Louis.
Molly, thanks. I appreciate the opportunity to share some thoughts with our members on these really important topics in a rapidly evolving policy landscape.
Well, we're glad to have you. So we have a new administration and a new Congress. Talk a little bit about the lay of the land now at the White House, at federal agencies, and on Capitol Hill.
For the last 2 years, President Trump, while he was a candidate, was talking a lot about energy and reinvesting in American energy. A lot of those themes were captured in a letter that Jim Matheson, NRECA CEO, sent the president in December between the election and the inauguration, which captured a lot of the concepts and ideas both that President Trump has been talking about for the last 2 years, but more importantly, what electric cooperatives have been talking about for several years, about the importance of repealing regulations that are impeding our ability to deliver safe, affordable, reliable power, about fixing a broken permitting system, about ensuring that we have access to right-of-ways to ensure that we can protect from wildfires, reversing harmful policies that might breach the lower Snake River dams in Washington state that provide 3,000 megawatts of carbon-free energy, about implementing infrastructure spending and incentive programs in a thoughtful, efficient way. These were all the things that we said to the president before he took office. And once he took office on January 20th, he quickly issued several executive orders related to energy. One entitled Unleashing American Energy, and the second where he declared a national energy emergency. And in both of these, he embodies many of these thematics that we've been carrying to our government for many years. But most importantly, he set out an ambitious agenda for how government can work better to ensure reliability and affordability. His executive orders captured the ideas of expediting permitting, about having a regulatory structure that doesn't force premature closure of generating assets, that supports deploying more energy resources to confront the challenge of our growing demand across the country. And so we are really optimistic that we're seeing a sea change in Washington at the executive branch level. In Congress has a really important role to capture the president's agenda and work towards implementing it. And so as the president has talked, as congressional leaders have talked, they've talked about a comprehensive package that deals with some of the president's priorities, about addressing the challenges at the southern border and immigration, about dealing with taxes and importantly, extending President Trump's tax cuts from 2017, and also about unleashing American energy and investing in American energy, having policies that allow us to produce more here at home and keep the lights on. So we're leaning into it. It's not going to be without challenges. It surely won't be without bumps, but we fully expect to have a collaborative relationship with both the new administration and the new Congress on working on this pro-energy policy agenda.
What are some of the main things that NRECA would like to see on the federal policy level, given the new realities in Washington?
There's a couple of different places, and they sit some with Congress and some with the administration. First, we want to make sure that they undo and repeal a lot of the regulatory initiatives of the previous administration that are impeding our ability to do the work we need to do. Whether it's the greenhouse gas rule for power plants, whether it's a string of other regulations issued by the Environmental Protection Agency, which are either going to increase the cost of energy production or force premature closures. We want to walk back some of the regulations from the Department of Interior, notably at the Bureau of Land Management, which is going to make it harder to access right-of-ways, and implementation of the Endangered Species Act, which puts species protection above and beyond any other use of land and space. Things related to the Forest Service that are impeding access to right-of-ways on U.S. Forest Service lands. So on the regulatory side, we want to make sure that the regulatory construct is in the best interest of America's electric cooperatives that allows us to continue to make investments. Now, there's a paired issue, which is reforming the permitting process. And some of that can happen through the administration on how they interpret and implement the laws that are already on the books. But Congress has an important role to play here too. It takes far too long to get a permit. Multiple agencies are engaging. When you're trying to build something, you should need to go to a single lead agency. That's just common sense. You should be able to get that permit on a timeline that you understand at the front end and can make investments that align with what the timeline is going to be. And once you get those permits, you shouldn't be stuck in endless litigation to try to get that project built, whether it's a transmission line or improvements to a distribution system or to build more generation. And so as we think about our priorities, I think that's the starting point. We also want to make sure that incentives, whether it's tax incentives or grant programs that allow electric cooperatives to make important investments in reliability and resiliency, get fully implemented. We think that the programs that electric cooperatives are leveraging, whether it's direct pay tax credits, grant programs at the Department of Agriculture, grant programs at the Department of Energy, these programs are really important and allow for important, significant investments that are going to be able to allow our co-ops around the country to keep the lights on and create downward pressure on pricing in an environment where prices are rising. It will also let us make sure that we can meet the challenge of growing demand, especially demand being driven by new data centers and new uses of electricity.
Yeah, and on the topic of the incentive and grant programs, Louis, you mentioned how those can enable co-ops to make important investments in their systems. But the White House recently put a 90-day freeze in place to examine some of these programs. How will the new political landscape affect these funding programs for co-ops, and what is NRECA's advocacy approach to protect them?
Molly, I think it's a really important question. So first, I understand how frustrating it can be for co-ops around the country that have invested the time and energy to apply for these grants, to develop projects that meet the needs of their community, where the tax incentives are going to support it, and how frustrating and difficult this current uncertainty is. A couple of things to start with. First, the president implemented a 90-day pause. Now, it is not uncommon for a new administration to implement a pause. So we should understand that even though we are frustrated and concerned, that this is not unusual. The second piece is what's most important here is to defend the projects that electric cooperatives are engaged in around the country, to talk about the merits and the value of those projects. We as NRECA are partnering with our members and talking with them and for them to government partners, both in Congress and in the new administration, which is still staffing up, which we should talk about. We need to be able to tell our story and shape our narrative. We need to lean into the value that these projects bring to our communities, to bring more resources online, to invest in resiliency of the electric grid, to ensure reliability, and how that fits in with our plans for our community and the important benefits they bring to our community. So we're going to talk to the right policymakers. We did that when these programs were enacted. We worked with the previous administration to get the programs implemented effectively, and we will continue to carry that voice to the new administration and the new Congress, many of which in Congress have heard us talk about the value of these projects and the investments they're making in our co-op communities. So having a cohesive message that is centered on our responsible use of federal funds and that talks about the value of these projects, that is the cornerstone of how we're going to carry that voice to Congress and the administration and partner with our members to do that.
And what would be your advice for co-ops as they talk to policymakers about these projects?
Molly, it fits right in with that advocacy strategy, which is be simple. Talk about the things that you're doing and why you're doing them. And don't be shy about it. Talk about how they're going to invest in resiliency and reliability, how it's going to help create stability, how it's going to meet the need of growing demand. There's data centers that are looking to site their facilities on your system, and how building more generation, expanding transmission, investing in your distribution system, all through these federal programs are going to enable you to provide power to those new users while ensuring reliability and affordability for your existing consumer members.
Let's pause here for a word from our sponsor, and when we come back, Louis and I will talk about what the Trump administration could do with the Environmental Protection Agency's power plant greenhouse gas rule.
Support for Along Those Lines comes from Power and Tel, who wants you to know that they are proud to support electric cooperatives with the products and expertise needed to expand broadband and strengthen infrastructure. For communication networks of all sizes, they deliver what you need when you need it. With industry-leading inventory and commitment to service, Power and Tel keeps your projects on track. Visit them at Tech Advantage 2025, booth 2401.
I'm Jennifer Chrisman Shia from the Electric Cooperatives of Arkansas in Little Rock. You're listening to Along Those Lines.
Welcome back. Next, we'll hear from Louis on the fate of the EPA's rule to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from power plants, which the Biden administration finalized last year. Another issue, and shifting gears a little bit, co-ops are watching what happens to the EPA's power plant greenhouse gas rule, which you referenced earlier. Remind us what the rule is, where it stands, and what's likely to happen next.
So this is a well-covered topic with our membership that we've been talking about for several years. The Biden administration proposed and ultimately finalized a regulation through the Clean Air Act, which would put restrictions on greenhouse gases from fossil generating units. They excluded existing natural gas, and their regulation focuses on coal units and new gas units. And they require what's called a best system of emissions reduction for those units. And the system they chose was carbon capture and sequestration. And you'd have to capture 90% of the carbon from your existing coal units or your new gas units. The technology still hasn't been deployed. And though electric cooperatives are leading the way in trying to demonstrate first of its kind carbon capture on a full scale in North Dakota and in Wyoming, nothing's been built yet. So the technology hasn't been proven. NRECA argued in the regulatory process that the rule was unlawful and exceeded the authorities that Congress had provided to EPA. We've challenged it in court. It is currently sitting at the DC Circuit Court of Appeals, where oral arguments were had in the fourth quarter of last year. A decision could come at any point. Now, that is kind of the pre-election, pre-inauguration of President Trump kind of landscape. What we expect now, and I want to be careful to not be too speculative, is that the Trump administration, who has said that they want the regulation repealed, President Trump said it while he was a candidate, and he said it between Election Day and inauguration, and in one of his day one executive orders called for the repeal of the power plant greenhouse gas rule. We expect in the coming days that they'll take steps toward that. Some of those will be to navigate the litigation process. And we look forward to working with the Trump administration on the litigation. We expect their approach is going to be different than the previous administration, who was defending the rule in court. I think it would be reasonable for them to not defend it in court. But also, the new EPA is going to have to go through a new regulatory process. You can't just throw out a regulation. They're going to have to propose a new regulation which repeals the previous rule. And then they're going to have to move through public comment and finalize that repeal. And I expect, unfortunately, that we'll see litigation on the back end of that from those that were proponents of the Biden administration's rule. Unfortunately, Molly, it creates a whole lot of uncertainty for our members as they think about planning. As just last week, the new administrator of EPA, Lee Zeldin, was confirmed by the United States Senate. So he will start developing his staff team. There are what are called sub-cabinet officials, the deputy administrator and the assistant administrator who runs the air office at EPA. They will have to get put before the Senate and confirmed as well as a whole lot of other Trump appointees to the EPA. And we've been having those conversations with the Trump transition. We are now having them with folks as they are getting seated into their offices at the agency, and we look forward to working with them to help support their efforts. And Molly, let me put one last piece on this. As we went through the regulatory process and refuted the proposed rule and in court have now challenged the final rule, we worked really closely with our generation and transmission co-ops to have a really good body of work and brought together lots of great minds around the technology and legal minds around the boundaries of the law. But why that really matters and why it mattered then, why it mattered in the litigation, and why it matters now is doing your homework on these regulations really matters, especially when you want to take that playbook, all that homework. We're going to take our full kind of body of work and bring it to the new EPA, which will underpin their justifications for the next steps that they will take, both in court and through the regulatory process. And we feel really good about how strong that body of work was. It was referenced a lot by others in the regulatory process. It was referenced a lot as we went through the DC Circuit oral arguments. So doing the work early and doing it well, I think really did pay off then and will continue to pay off now.
And I know we can't speculate or get too far ahead, but what would NRECA like to see in a potential successor rule?
We actually don't want a successor rule. We just want them to repeal this rule. And that is fully in bounds for them to do that. The law provides for them to, as long as they can justify that the regulation as proposed before goes outside the bounds of the law, they can justify repealing the rule. And just as a matter of background, the previous administration had also proposed a rule. It was the replacement for the Obama Clean Power Plan. And both the Obama Clean Power Plan and the Trump era ACE rule were both thrown out by the Supreme Court shortly after President Trump took office the first time. So we're probably at a point where if Congress wants the EPA to do something on greenhouse gases, then Congress is probably going to have to speak to do that, and they're going to have to amend the Clean Air Act to do that. And I don't see that as a likely outcome in this Congress.
And shifting gears to a new topic, you discussed permitting reform and how that's a priority. What is the outlook for that in the coming years, and how could this new makeup of Congress in the White House affect these policies?
Molly, in the last Congress, there was actually a pretty sustained effort to try to reform the permitting process by a bipartisan group of members in both chambers of Congress. So you had members of the House, members of the Senate, both parties working together. And 90% of what they were proposing kind of lines up with some of my comments earlier about creating more certainty, about having a single agency, about expediting the review process, ending the era of ongoing, almost boundless litigation. But as they do that, there was one component related to federal transmission, which would have created a hugely expanded federal grab of regulation over electric cooperatives in a way that we're not currently regulated by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And we raised serious concerns to that in the previous Congress. We are hopeful that as Congress works on statutory permitting reforms, that they will take our counsel and grab the things that make sense and throw out the piece that would have a more expanded federal regulatory oversight over our cooperatives who are self-governed and are doing a hell of a job of deploying projects that are in their best interest. The other thing that I think is really important is as we build new transmission, especially new transmission, that we allocate those costs to those that receive the benefit, and that we're not the only ones that feel that way. There's a lot of voices in the electric industry that feel that way, and we're going to continue to carry that. On the administration side, I think that having interpretation of the National Environmental Protection Act, or NEPA, by the Biden administration is going to make it more difficult to build things, not less. And I expect that the Trump administration is going to really take a hard look at the regulations promulgated in the last administration and frankly take a step back to the NEPA implementations that President Trump worked for 3 years on in his previous administration and finalized in his last year. I think we're going to see an early move back to those regulations, and we are optimistic that that has a chance of success.
Okay, optimism is good. On to a new topic. Wildfires pose a growing threat for co-ops and the communities they provide power to, particularly in the West. What could this new administration and Congress do to help co-ops avoid wildfires and respond to this threat?
There's a bunch of different things that Congress has been knocking around. And unfortunately, the last administration moved on regulations that are making it more difficult. So let me first deal with the executive action, then we'll pivot back to Congress. There were proposed regulations by the U.S. Forest Service and finalized regulations by the Bureau of Land Management that make it really difficult for co-ops to access their right-of-ways, to do common sense things like get rid of hazard trees or do clearing of the right-of-way or make sure you're getting rid of underbrush that's laying near the lines. I mean, this is just common sense stuff, right? If you have a fallen tree in your yard and you've had drought conditions, you're surely going to get it out of there and make sure that both the lightning or a spark doesn't ignite it. And I think we should be able to apply those same kind of common sense principles to how we manage our right of way. So we're hopeful that the new administration will walk back some of those kind of silly regulations that have put conservation in front of all other uses on federal lands. The other thing we want to make sure that they do is manage strict liability better. When an electric cooperative has a wildfire mitigation plan and that co-op has done the work and documented that they've done the work, there's also events that happen that are at no fault of the utility, no fault of the co-op. And so even if the electric line is what caused the fire, even though all the mitigation steps have been taken to avoid that, we want to make sure that our co-ops and most importantly, our consumer members don't fully bear the financial burden of that incident, that awful things happen and we shouldn't be looking for someone to blame when they've done the right thing. In Congress can take steps as well. And there's been bipartisan legislation in the House that's passed the House of Representatives in the previous Congress, and then again in this Congress called the Fix Our Forests Act. There's also legislation that was pending in the Senate in the last Congress that allows you to get out the dead wood without having to go through a timber sale. These are important legislative initiatives that would reshape the law a little bit, put the public land agencies in a better position, put our cooperatives in a better position to do the vegetation management that they need to do to ensure the integrity of their systems. So we're going to work in both chambers, definitely focus our efforts on this in the Senate again this year to try to get this piece of legislation passed. Hopefully the new majority in the Senate will see the wisdom of bipartisan legislation from the House that passed overwhelmingly again this year, and we can get that enacted into law and implemented.
So we've talked about EPA regulations and how they could change, permitting reform, some of the federal funding programs co-ops use, any other kind of big opportunities you see for good outcomes for co-ops in the coming years?
I started off by saying that we're optimistic. There is now an opportunity to have an all-of-government approach to a pro-energy policy agenda. And I think all the things that I've walked through, and you used my word back to me on optimism, we're optimistic that there's a great opportunity. And as electric cooperatives, we should be ambitious and we should be bold. We should lean into the challenges of growing demand and the opportunities to build more infrastructure and make investments that are durable. That, the last 80 years for electric cooperatives have been magnificent, and making investments today will carry us forward for the next 80 years, whether it's data centers or some new growing demand. And at the same time, make investments that can make our systems more effective, more efficient, more resilient to storm and fires, and ensure that we can bring more resources to bear. And we need government partners to ensure and help us do that. And so I think that we have this great opportunity to lean in and tell our story. We should never take for granted with policymakers, new and old, and when I say old, not old by age, but they've been in office for a while, that they understand exactly what an electric cooperative is and the perspective we bring to a conversation. We should always lead off discussions with them about kind of doing that quote unquote co-op 101, talking about who we are, our values as cooperatives, that we are about people, not profits, that we're not-for-profit utilities that provide power at cost and are committed to reliability and affordability. And I think that every time we lean into that, it really does help set the tone for our policy asks. And so I encourage all of our members to be talking to their policymakers, that we should seize this opportunity to share with them what's working and what's not in government, and how we want to be good partners and good stewards of the responsibility and the trust that's been put in our hands by our communities.
I think that's a great mission for co-ops and for NRECA to keep in mind as we move ahead in this new world in Washington. Final question, and I know this is $1 million one. What are your predictions about what things could look like in Congress and in the White House a year from now?
Sure. Well, Molly, I'm pretty confident that my crystal ball is cracked, and it's the only reason that I can't get anything right on predictions anymore. So I'm going to try not to speculate too much. Look, I think what's really important to remember is early days of an administration tend to have a lot of fireworks. The executive orders, statements by the president. But there's an old saying in politics, which is people make policy. And as the administration continues to nominate and appoint people into roles, we'll start to see the executive orders become actions by agencies and then become implementations. And that takes a little while. And so I think that as time goes, especially for us, we'll have a more clear picture once we obviously get past this 90-day freeze in federal funding. What is that outlook? The president wants to be ambitious and wants Congress to move what's called a reconciliation package, which deals with spending and revenue, which will deal with tax cuts and royalties from oil and gas and mineral extraction, and will invest in the president's priorities. That should happen sometime this year. I mean, if it doesn't happen this year, it's going to be really hard for them to get it done next year, in my opinion, in an election year. So I think that's what the outlook is. But it's important to remember that this Congress is very narrowly divided, and legislating's hard in a really narrow Congress where the House majority is only 5 seats. So we are committed to carrying our voice consistently and often. And we will be at the table whenever policy issues that affect our membership are being discussed. And we look forward to partnering with our membership to do that.
So more to come, and it looks like we'll have to have you back later to update us on what's next. Louis, appreciate you coming on along those lines and hope to talk to you soon.
Thanks, Molly. I always appreciate the opportunity.
And thanks to you, our listeners, and our sponsor, Power and Tell. For more on this and other podcasts, visit us at electric.coop. Until next time, for Along Those Lines, I'm Molly Christian.
I'm Kyle Allwine from Northern Neck Electric Cooperative in Warsaw, Virginia. Thanks for listening to Along Those Lines. Subscribe and rate us on your favorite podcast app.